Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending the G2 Integrated Solutions webinar, a practical approach to getting ready for the gas mega rule. My name is Marissa Davis, and I'll be facilitating this morning's presentation. We do have a very large group on the line and a lot to cover today, folks, so we're going to save questions for the end of the webinar. So at any point during the presentation, if you have any questions, go ahead and just submit them in the question box. The panel will be happy to answer them afterwards. The host of today's webinar, G2 Integrated Solutions, delivers expertise to pipeline operators, utility companies, and other energy stakeholders in 7 specialized service disciplines. We provide end-to-end solutions that help manage risk, assure compliance, and optimize performance. For more details on our services, please visit our website at www.g2-is.com. All right, now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's discussion, Elena Herron. Elena serves as manager for G2's Regulatory and Technical Services Department. She's a licensed attorney with several years of experience in the energy industry with a focus towards DOT regulation compliance, regulatory audits, and project management. And at this point, we'll turn it over to you, Elena.
Thank you, Marissa. I'd like to invite our panelists for this morning. Michael Oliver is the Principal Regulatory Specialist. He has 42 years of industry experience. Next, we have Louis, who's Senior Executive Lead in the first years of experience. We have Daryl, who is G2's Manager of the IT Department. He has 20 years of industry experience. We also have Mark Trivig. He is Vice President of Engineering with 35 plus years of experience in the industry, as well as Hamoud Raymond, G2's Principal Engineer. Michael Oliver will start us out with a high-level overview of gas compliance. Michael.
Thank you, Elena. And good morning, everyone. So as most of you may know, PHMSA is finalizing a new rule to the safety gas transmission, distribution, and gathering pipelines that could nearly double the length of the current 192 regulations. The rule was initiated after the 2010 San Bruno pipeline incident and addresses numerous associated MAOP recommendations, as well as the congressional mandates that came from recent reauthorizations of the Pipeline Safety Act. The first part of the final rule is undergoing OMB review as we speak. Its final hurdle, and it has made it through the Technical Advisory Committee process and through oversight of an administration who is focused on deregulation. Due to the size and complexity of the new rule, it's been split into 3 smaller rules. The first, expected this fall, or really any time now, will apply to transmission and distribution pipelines. It will focus primarily on satisfying those outstanding mandates and NTSB recommendations, and will include new MAOP reconfirmation requirements and an expansion of assessment requirements. The second part, expected by the end of this year, will apply to transmission and distribution pipelines as well, and will include criteria for repair, integrity management, cathodic protection, and a management of change component. The third part, likely next year, will apply to gathering pipelines and will include a redefinition, if you will, of gathering. And you'll hear more about that in a little bit.
Thank you, Michael. Now we'll have Anna Flunway. She'll kick off our discussion of topics included in the first part of the rule. The discussion is interactive, so panelists feel free to jump in and contribute your comments and insight as we go along.
Thank you, Elena. Good morning, everybody. So part 1 is one of the 3 original 2016 rulemaking. This only covers transmission pipeline. And the topics that are included in this part one include fracture mechanics, spike tests, spike testing, the definition of traceable, verifiable, complete. That was defined in the 2012 PHMSA advisory bulletin. For the purpose of this webinar, we're just going to focus on the record changes requirement, record requirement section, and we're also going to be reviewing or talking about practical approaches to material verification and MAOP determination and reconfirmation, and as well MCA determination. In subsequent webinars, we'll go ahead and discuss other parts of the first part of the mega rule. So, okay, so PHMSA is proposing to improve the record requirements for design, construction, and operations of transmission pipeline. One of the common language that we have noticed so far is that they are requiring that operators start retaining records for some section of records and documentation of some sections within 192. For example, weld qualification, that's 192.227, they are requiring that operators retain the welder's qualification for 5 years after installation. But what should operators be focused on now? What should they be looking at? The question here is, how will you collect these records? How do you intend to integrate them into your system? Are you going to collect them electronically, or are you going to just continue with paperwork? The other part, or the other question is the quality of record. How do you define the quality of the content of that record? How do you start from the get-go to mitigate or reduce potential gaps? And the other question is, where will all this record and documentation be residing? Do you want it to be accessible to different groups within the organization?
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Ann, as you collect the records, understand that, you've got to deal with both the PHMSA audit level stuff and the records within the operational aspects of it. So, you definitely want to make sure you keep all your records in a, at least from a PHMSA perspective, in a consistent location, one easily accessible, one easy to get through. You really don't want to hang around and have a PHMSA auditor go through every piece of paper you got in your whole company. So make sure that as you do that, you keep these records in a tight, consistent spot. Make sure all of your hydro test records are all together. Make sure your MTRs can tie back to the well records and that stuff. We've seen recently, as some job books are coming out from, for some of the projects that we've been involved with, that the hydro test record is in 14 different places, and there's 150, 200 pieces of paper between, say, the test record, the log sheet, and then the calibration record, which if you hang that in front of an auditor, he's going to go through every piece of paper to find. So be cognizant of how you have your records stored as well. I know, Michael, you've got some other information as far as what's complete, verifiable, those kinds of things they need to be.
Well, the important part is that every record that you need to demonstrate compliance with any of the requirements, including your policies and procedures, your O&M manuals, the records that you're going to use to demonstrate that you did what you say you do, they all need to be well managed. They need to be protected from anybody getting to them that shouldn't and making changes, edits. They need to be very secured, and they need to be readily accessible to anyone who needs them, as you said, from both a compliance demonstration standpoint, but also from a user standpoint.
So this next slide, we're going to be talking about going through the planning process for doing your material verification through to your MAOP reconfirmation. Most importantly is for the stakeholders to be in the room and define the scope of what they want to achieve. Have the compliance guy in the room and talk about the record requirement, the MAOP requirement. Talk about the targeted records that can help you achieve the end goal. Define what your default values are going to be throughout the process. And also ask yourself the questions, are there other measures that you want to put in place to increase your confidence level throughout the process? Then the next part is data management. Do you have all these papers sitting in a storage, in a box? Are we going to scan it? Are we going to index this paperwork? Are we going to digitize it? Are we going to have a naming convention so that the record is searchable in our system? Also, you're going to talk about the data capturing part of this process. How do you want to capture this data? Do you want to capture it on Excel? Do you want to do it on Access? Either ways, you want to put it on a database or a platform that it can be easily integrated into your entire system. The other part is, where will all of this information reside? Do you want it to reside in your GIS, or is there any other repository where you would like that those records or those data to be stored? The next step is your material verification process. Go ahead and do those research. After digitizing or collecting the paperwork, how do you go in there and do the research and obtain the critical parameters that you need to calculate your MAOP? While you're doing that, there's a need for you to establish your record gaps and as well your MAOP gaps. And once you get to that point, excuse me, once you get to that point, you also want to begin to prioritize those gaps. Develop a strategy to resolve the gap, and as well recommendations and remedial actions that you outline your recommendations and remedial actions to mitigate those gaps. But it's critical for you to know what you want to do before going into MAOP reconfirmation. PHMSA is proposing some 6 methods that can be used for MAOP reconfirmation. But before you go into that, are there other steps within best practices or practices out there that you can do to mitigate some of those gaps before going into those 6 methods?
And if you don't mind, if I can speak to some of the best practices, as you begin construction, long before you ever strike the first arc, operations has to get involved, or your records people have to get involved. There's too much information at the field construction level that sometimes gets pushed aside because the construction guys are so focused on getting the pipeline in. But you really do need in today's world, especially with the GIS, what you're going to end up having to do with the MPMS, all of that is you need to identify where every weld is. You need to have a lat long on that. You need to identify the heat numbers of each joint of pipe. You really do need to have an X-ray record for each weld that, whether it passed or failed or whether it was not part of the film taking. All of that has to occur at the construction level, and it's usually not a worry of the construction guy, but the operations guys, the ones who have to deal with the paperwork, need to be involved from even before the arc is struck.
Yeah. And this goes to something that we do in-house here. We call it the forensic gap analysis. We've realized that sometimes there are ways to mitigate these gaps that some operators are not looking into. And this could be going back to the manufacturer of that pipeline to see, hey, can we get records or information about this pipe we bought from you? It could also be a situation where the construction company, when they were done with the installation, did they hand over all of the completions report or closing out report? Can you go back to the construction company and obtain more information about the pipeline installed? The other part of it is you can also go back to the field offices. The field offices out there might have boxes of information stored in an attic or stored in somebody's desk. But do not leave any stone unturned. Go back, do all of those researches, and find out ways to mitigate these gaps. Also, there are some technologies out there that can be used to help mitigate these gaps. And I know, Hamoud, you have some things out there that are good practices but are not very popular in the industry. Go ahead, please.
Yes, so there's a number of technologies available in the market that can be utilized to mitigate your material gaps. Some of them are recognized by PHMSA and they are in 192. For example, you can do lab tensile testing, which is a form of destructive testing. Basically involves cutting coupons, taking it to a metallurgical lab. There are also non-destructive emerging technologies that can be utilized. For example, indentation NDE can be used in combination with chemical analysis done by PMI, and that gives you a good confidence level as far as the material grade is concerned. So there are things out there that can be utilized, and in fact, G2 did some presentations on those at the API and PPI conferences, and the presentations can be made available if anybody wants to look at.
You know, a technology that's well known for one part of it is ultrasonic thickness testing. I mean, wall thickness, we should never not know wall thickness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the ILI, there's emerging ILI technologies that tell you the steel grade and seam weld type, so they're in the works as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and you get into these other technologies and you talk about the ramifications if you don't have records. It gets expensive really fast, having to pressure test a line, having to take pressure reduction. So I think you talked about it, Ann, really hitting home. Make sure you go over all your options, uncover all your rock, look under every rock and figure out if you can fill in those record gaps. Because as you mentioned, records could be off-site. They could be just sitting in an office somewhere, sitting in field offices, as you mentioned. So, I think.
Yeah, we found them. We found them in a retired operator's garage. So,
Yeah.
So
I mean, they're everywhere.
So you want to go through that process and exhaust all your resources before you have to take those next steps.
Yeah, and those next steps that are being proposed by PHMSA is, pressure testing the line, replacing the line, and pressure reduction. But before you go into that, make sure you, like he said, don't leave any stone unturned. But if you decide to do that, you need, as an organization, what do you need to ask yourself? Is it cost effective? Are we going to meet the timeline required to get all of this done? And is the process or the decision that you take sustainable within your organization? So right now I'm going to pass on to Daryl to talk about data governance.
So far we've been talking a lot about records management. So what is a roadmap for effective record and data management? So we've got data coming in from all over the place. If we're talking new construction, there's just an enormous amount of data generated on a new construction project. Just maintaining your pipeline systems, there's a lot of records generated. So we need to understand where all the different data is coming from. Is it spatial data? Is it something that you have to keep for the life of the pipeline? So these are all the questions you start asking about when you're starting to develop a data governance program. So with a proper data governance program, we're going to answer all these questions. We're going to protect ourselves. We're going to meet all the needs of regulatory, engineering operations, compliance, and really support the overall operations and be effective in that manner. What really drives this is SME input. What's important to them, what's important from the compliance group, engineering group, operations. And put this into your processes and procedures and let that dictate how you manage your data. So if you've got a well-organized workflow process established, doing things like TVC, doing data migrations, conditioning your data, all becomes much more systematic. And then the things you have to talk about in this whole program is, where are we going to manage this data? We've talked about that already. Now, ideally, from a data management standpoint, you want a single source record. If that's possible, that's the way you want to go. But in complex organizations and enterprises, there may be multiple systems that need to talk to each other. So it's at this stage, the earlier you talk about this and start integrating all these systems together, the better from a data governance perspective. So, where are we storing the pipeline data? Is it going to be in a database model? There's standards out there like PODS and UPDM. How are we going to manage those scans? We talked a little about scanning before. So more and more, we're going toward scanning our documents. And what I would say on that front, make sure I've seen this before where we scan documents and they're not legible. And so we want to make sure we're getting good scans, getting it right in the system. Just because we're scanning all these records doesn't mean we want to get rid of the paper records. That's something you might not want to store it in your main office, but maybe off-site storage, because you don't want to lose that, because maybe you did have a bad scan, maybe something gets erased. So you always want to keep those records. Just because you have a scanned document doesn't mean you just throw away all your paper records. I would recommend against that.
And the other aspect of it, in particular, I usually fixate on the hydrostatic test reports. You see a lot of times where you have the chart in the front and all the information's on the back.
Yeah.
If the front and the back don't tie to each other with a name, with a unique ID, then you don't have a record.
Yeah.
You need to make sure all the calibration sheets, all the log sheets, all the procedures, everything tied back to a unique identifier so that you do have a valid TBC level record.
Yeah, and that all goes back to the process validation. Write it out in your policies and procedures on how that record should be coming in. And it makes it so much easier to go through the whole process and manage that data. So for all the electronic files, are you managing it through a document management system? Are you tying that document management system to your GIS system? These are all things that you can definitely do today. And once again, the goal is to go toward this single source of record where everything's integrated together. And with technology the way it's going, where you're able to pull in data for from the web services and stuff like that, it just really enhances the overall enterprise if you put all that in mind in your overall arching data governance program. And a big part of that is, as you mentioned earlier, about security. Good data governance, a big part of that is making sure your data is secure.
And while it may sound like none of this stuff relates to the new rules, all of it relates to the new rules, because there is a requirement in there for procedures and policies to be updated and improved upon.
Yeah, in the regulatory world, if you haven't defined what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and be able to demonstrate through records that you have done it, then you didn't do it.
Absolutely. So one of the new requirements that's coming out of this phase 1 rule is the moderate consequence area analysis, so the MCA. So this is going to change things for years now. We've had high consequence areas. It's well understood. All the operators take this into account. So now we're introducing this new consequence, the moderate consequence area. So this is going to be significant for operators to account for. Basically, what this is saying, for any pipeline operating greater than 30% of SMICE, that we're going to look at if within a PIR, if there's greater than 5 buildings, and that's going to add this new consequence to a lot of operators. So a lot of operators who maybe never had a high consequence area before, maybe more of a rural area, there's a good chance that they may have MCAs now. One of the things that's been debated back and forth, and I'll be interested to see how it turns out in the final rule, is the identified sites. So these are the areas that may be difficult to evacuate, or these may be areas like a business. It's been gone back and forth. Originally, they were looking at an identified site for MCAs to have 5 or more people. Now they've gone back and maybe they don't want to change that definition of identified site, and they want to leave the same definition as it is for HCAs. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the final rule shows there.
And we as G2, and I know you as a particular lead in the team, we've done some MCAs. So why don't you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, in 2016, we did an MCA. We just, as PHMSA dropped the initial definition for it, and we kind of modeled a tool to do the MCA analysis. One of the struggles that we had doing that was the ID site, capturing the ID site and verifying exactly what is there. We found cases where some houses that is intended for intended for human occupancy is actually used as a daycare. At that point, it's no longer a buy hole. It is an ID site, and which automatically changes that location to a HCA area. So, and it's very important to get all of that verified ahead of the rule dropping.
Another big component of the MCA is if you have a 4-lane or wider roadway, that will also cause an MCA. So that's going to take some new integration that we haven't been doing in the past. So how's this going to really affect operators? And a lot of it depends on, I think, where they go with the identified sites. If they leave the identified site, that definition the same as it is for high consequence areas, then I don't think it'll has as big of an impact as if you were going to have to go back to 5 sites. If they go that route, there's going to be you're going to have to confirm your existing structure data anyways, but that's going to really cause a lot of verification, like you mentioned. Something like a small daycare that could cause something, because initially people were just looking for 20 or more people in an area. So like I said, it'll be really interesting how the final rule plays out. But regardless of how that comes, accounting for this is a constant field data collection and verifying out in the field what you have. So there's going to be confirming your existing data, updating your data, doing a lot of field data collection, and more we're moving toward electronic field data collection to help ease the use of collecting the data and then integrating the data back into your system in a timely manner. And this goes all back to your data governance. From a field data collection standpoint, you got well-defined procedures and processes to collect that data. It's so much easier to get it back in your system in a timely manner. You're going to have to figure out how to get the road data in. There's lots of different sources for road data. You can get this kind of data at the state level, at the federal level. So each organization is going to have to figure out how they want to integrate that data in. Whatever tools they're using currently to do their HC analysis will need to be updated to account for the changes in the rule. So you'll want to make sure that you're working with your vendors to make sure your tools are up to date and able to handle the new rule changes.
So let me ask this question. So if an operator is just going ahead or trying to just run an MCA tool, what would be your advice to him? Would it make sense for him to the operator to run both the HCA and the MCA simultaneously and have the capability of dynamically segmenting the pipelines?
Yeah, I think this is something that most operators are reviewing on an annual basis. So you don't want to have to run these tools separately. You want one package tool that can account for run an HCA, your MCAs, and of course your class location too. Yeah. And this is all stuff that can be ran through one tool, and then, as you mentioned, just dynamically segment it. So obviously high consequence areas will take a priority over MCAs, so a dynamically segmented process will put that up in your GIS and deliver one final product. So ideally, it's going to be one tool that you would want to run to do all of your analysis. And then, the key to this, the MCA is it's something brand new, so you're going to want to account for this. You're going to want to update your procedures, all your field forms to account for the regulations as they're pertaining to the MCAs. And then, this is a new consequence that's being defined, so you're going to want to integrate that into your risk program. The overall impact to the industry, it's going to vary. I think a lot of your big operators are probably well positioned to handle this. They'll need to update their tools, but they've been collecting this data for a while. There may be do some verification on that end. I think it's going to affect your medium to smaller operators more because they may not have dealt with a whole lot of HCAs. So for these, there's going to be new integrity requirements for these MCA areas. So if you don't have HCAs and you haven't been assessing these lines, you're now going to have to. So this could definitely affect the manpower and budgets for these systems. If your pipeline is defined as an MCA, you've got 14 years to do an initial baseline assessment, and after that, you're going to be on a 10-year assessment interval. So I think a lot of operators are going to be impacted by this.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights in that area. We'll now have to move Raymond. He'll be discussing some of the anticipated changes to integrity management program.
Thanks, Elena. Hello, everyone. So basically, PHMSA is proposing to amend 192 subpart O to add more requirements. What does that mean? Currently, everyone is required to have integrity management program for the covered areas, which are basically your HCAs. But now you got, within HCAs, you got even more requirements, and outside HCAs, I mean, some of those requirements will, filter and go out into outside HCA areas. What does all that mean? You got new assessment methods that are being proposed. Currently, there's only 3 or 4. You got ILI, you got pressure test, you got direct assessment, which includes ECDA, ICDA, SECDA, and the 4th one is other technology. Which requires 180-day notification to PHMSA. And it includes guided wave and other technologies. So there are 3 new proposed technologies or assessment methods being proposed. That'll make it a total of 7. Those 3 additional ones are spike test, in situ, direct assessment, and guided wave. And now there are new requirements for selecting and using those assessment methods as well. And what does that mean? You got incorporation of industry standards directly into the code rather than adding code language. You can expect to see a lot more direct references to industry standards. For example, for ILI, a lot more references to API 1163, ILI PQ, NACE SP0102, NACE SP0206 for ICDA, SP0204 for SCCDA. So I expect to see a lot more incorporation of direct incorporation of industry standards. New preventative and mitigative measures. Currently, there are 9 threats and PNM measures associated with those 9 threats. So there are new PNM measures being proposed that could include shutoff valves, remote control valves, permanent monitoring of your pipeline, computerized monitoring, leak detection systems, and a lot more PNM measures regarding external and internal corrosion. So I expect new additions to that part of 192 subpart O. Repair criteria, there will be much more stringent repair criteria as far as timeframes and deadlines are concerned. And a lot more stricter criteria for corrosion control, basically more electrical surveys, closed interval surveys, annual surveys, more explicit requirements for internal corrosion control, for example, product analysis and testing, and more stringent requirements for external corrosion, CP, CIS, and so on and so forth. So I expect to see a lot more stringent requirements as far as the integrity management programs are concerned.
I have a question. So will there be IMP changes for pipeline-related facilities, such as like a storage facility? What do you think?
Yes, it remains to be seen, but if your facility checks all the right boxes or the wrong boxes, then it may be lumped with pipeline integrity management program. For example, if your facility directly impacts an HCA, then it probably will be lumped into your regular integrity management program.
Okay. Thank you, Hamoud. The third part of the proposed rule deals with changes to gas gathering requirements, and Daryl will provide us an update.
So, with some recent meetings, there's been a lot of changes going on since this is part 3 and the first away. There's still a lot of things going around with this, and it will be once again interesting to see how the rule plays out. But one of the main things is just defining what a gathering line is. Traditionally, the industry's used API RP80 for determining what a gathering line is, and I know Mark, you have some opinions on that.
Well, I have a lot of opinions on a lot of things. But, you look at RP80 and it's 65 plus pages to try to determine how to define a gathering line. And, PHMSA initially was trying to condense a 65-page document down to three words. So I know that it's been pulled back, that, that their API and their committees are now working again to to try and address that and kind of clean that definition up to make it a whole lot easier to understand.
Yeah. I think it's PHMSA's position that they want anything from the well to the transmission line to be defined as a gathering line. And if you looked, at the previous definitions, it was really ambiguous, and there was a lot of hemming and hawing on what could be considered a gathering line. So I think whatever pans out, and like I said, as you mentioned, they're really leaning toward API to help define that, and whatever comes out, I think it's going to be a better, much simpler definition of what a gathering line is.
And regardless of where the definition goes, I mean, there's still some things right now that you have to comply with, and that's the endpoint. You've got to be able to define where the endpoint of the line is. The original rule wanted to define also the begin point. It's not in there at the moment, but hey, that's coming. We know it's coming. So get used to GIS in your lines as you put them all in. Make sure you know where the endpoints are, and again, make sure that you are at least comfortable and knowledgeable of what API RP80 is pointing you to.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing some of the biggest impacts are going to be in this part 3. It's going to hit these gathering systems the hardest. One of the main things is whether you're regulated or currently unregulated. Unregulated gathering lines are going to be subject to annual reporting requirements, and that's a given at this point. And it's quite a number of things. They're going to have to report mileages by diameter, by CP coverage, by overpressure protection. If there's a leak or an incident on the line, they're going to have to report that. So this is going to be completely new to these unregulated gathering systems.
Some of the other ones, they're going to have to report on the status of line markers.
Yeah.
Guess what you're going to have to do that you haven't ever done before? You're going to have to get an operator ID. That is just by itself a fairly onerous process. And to do all these other things, if you're not used to doing them, you just added an amazing amount of work to your staff, or having to go out and hire consultants, of which there are dozens and dozens of them out there that can help you do it, including G2.
So one of the things that the unregulated gathering lines operators won't have to do is MPMS submissions. So those are the mapping submissions that are required by regulated lines. Now, a lot of these operators have both unregulated and regulated assets, so they're already doing MPMS submissions. And I would recommend using the GIS to manage that mileage. We're talking about managing mileage. The best way to do that is in the GIS system. Even if you're a completely unregulated gathering operator, but you may have a small GIS system for marketing purposes or operational purposes, that's also a great way to manage the reporting requirements that you're going to have to be doing. You could go down the spreadsheet route, but I would recommend against that. Especially if you start beginning to have different sources of data. You don't want to have these different silos where your compliance guys are reporting your annual reporting requirements via spreadsheet. You've got GIS guys doing marketing and operations. What's going to happen over time? Your mileages aren't going to match. Try to manage everything from a single source when we're talking about mileages, and make things much simpler, not just to get your baseline annual reports in, but just maintaining it from year to year.
And one other that we didn't have on this slide, but you're going to have to report incidents on unregulated gas gathering lines as well. That's also something new, and that just the information you would have to come up with that is going to be a significant effort to some of the smaller operators.
Yeah, and one of the things they're going to want to know, if you have an incident, where's that incident? That's going to be a requirement. They're going to want to know a lot long on those incidents, what type of incident occurred. So there's also going to be a lot of unregulated gathering lines that are currently unregulated. They're probably going to go to regulated status. This is another thing that's been going back and forth on this part 3. The biggest change right now is on you've got type A and type B gathering lines. The biggest change being proposed right now on type A, they're going to have a new area 2, where it's any class 1 location area with a diameter greater than 8 inches. This has gone back and forth. I think originally when the initial rule came out, it was this greater than 8 inch, but then PHMSA recommended going to 12 inches and using a PIR type analysis to determine what may be regulated. But there was a lot of pushback by the public at the last GPAC meeting in June. And PHMSA wound up agreeing and saying, let's go back to the 8-inch. I know they did leave it open for lines that are greater than 12 inches in this PIR type analysis that they were thinking about doing. In that case, they may still keep that and just have more regulatory requirements for those type of lines. But right now we're looking at anything greater than 8 inches is going to be regulated on these gathering systems. And we're talking 90,000 miles of currently unregulated. And if we look at the greater than 8-inch, it's a lot of potential mileage that's going to become regulated just overnight once that rule passes.
Yeah, just from the when they were at 12 and went back to 8, they added almost 60 to 70,000 miles of pipeline that went from an unregulated back into a regulated environment.
Yeah. So that's 90,000 miles of new regulated line, and then the reporting requirements just on unregulated, it's estimated over 400,000 miles of unregulated gathering lines. So now they're going to be, if not going to fully regulated, they're going to be, having reporting requirements. So that's pretty significant.
But again, out of that 400,000, because of this new rule, almost 20 to 25% of the unregulated lines are now being regulated, and the remaining 350,000, give or take, is still going to be subject to annual reporting requirements.
So for this new area 2, for the class 1 greater than 8 inches, so what are the new regulatory requirements? And there's a number of them listed on the slide here. It's going to change how you do design, installation, maintenance on your pipeline systems. There's going to be corrosion controls going to be needed. Now, if you look at on these gathering lines, the number one issue with any kind of release on those lines, it's corrosion. So it's very significant. So establishing corrosion control programs are going to be really important. They're going to be responsible for damage prevention, public awareness, establishing MAOP and documenting that, line markers, documenting repairs. Leakage surveys is another one, and there's been a lot of discussion on leakage surveys and how this is going to be done. And industry has said this is something that they would like to implement, but it's going to be expensive. It's going to take time. So it'll be interesting to see how the final rule is in regards to the time given for establishing leakage survey systems.
And on corrosion control, the stats that PHMSA was looking at, something in the neighborhood of 60+% of the leaks that occurred, the incidents that occurred on gathering lines, was due to corrosion. So it's a significant event. It's being looked at. It's highly visible to PHMSA. So there's a number of articles in the media, about I remember one I just read, occurred 2 or 3 years ago about the little girl in Midland. It was a 10-inch line that blew up. She lost her life because of corrosion. So it does carry risks. We need to be aware of it, and we're at the point where that's the reason these lines are getting regulated now.
Yeah. And I think that was a big pushback from the public because when they started looking at just greater than 12 inches, there was that pushback because of incidents like you just mentioned. So I think PHMSA understood that and agreed. And then above all, anytime you start introducing all of these new requirements, you're going to have a process to manage it. So procedure development, training, establishing emergency response plans. This is all going to be part of getting into the regulated world for these gathering operators.
Thank you, Darryl. Mark Trivik will now provide insights regarding anticipated impacts of the gas mega rule on differing operators.
Yeah, as we've gone through this, we kind of divided the industry into 3 categories. There's actually probably 400 million, but we can't talk about all those. So we've divided into a large, midstream, the transmission to distribution companies. I mean, these are the interstates, the ones, got thousands of miles of pipes and, thousands of employees and move millions of cubic feet of gas per day. There's the smaller midstreams. Those are the guys that, the transmission just that, we would say maybe they're just interstate operators. Maybe they're operating a 150-mile system. They're smaller companies. They're, doing what what they need to do. Like in the midstreams, they may have a lot of gathering assets. The transmission guys may not have any gathering assets, and probably a good mix of all of it. And then the last one, the accidental operators. And, I've got the word multinational oil companies up there, and I have it on there on purpose. It's not that, ExxonMobil doesn't have pipeline groups and well-versed in all of that work. Where I'm talking about is at the micro level, at the field level. There's a lot of places where a production, people may come in and they need to add a line from, a battery to a compressor station, and, completely unaware that, they need that they're now in a regulated environment. There's the chemical plants. There's, the refinery operators. They're operating lines that, because they cross a highway, are now in a regulated environment, and they never were aware of that. There's the small exploration and production companies. Those are the, I get laughed when I talk about it, but it's Bob and his son-in-law. They own 4 wells. They own, they produce 20 million of gas, and they've never known that they've been in a regulated environment. Now, a lot of those guys are out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, there's probably a class 1, but some of them might be in a situation because of the new rules with the MCAs. They may actually be in a lot more regulated environment that they knew, and they never did anything about it. So now the big guys, the first part of and the second part of the rule are going to probably primarily affect them. They're ready for that. They've got the staffs in place. They are well versed in, MAOP calculation. They've got their GIS. They know where their data is. They're subject to audits. Short of the MCA and some of the additional integrity management and risk management requirements, we don't anticipate it. It's really a huge financial impact because of again, they're ready for it. And, those are the first ones that are going to come down the pike. The smaller guys, they're aware of the rules. They operate in that environment, but they may not have the staff to be able to accommodate, the newer rules, in particular with the gathering. The MCAs, they may or may not be ready for that. If you're running 100 miles of line and then suddenly you've got to double up your records because of the integrity management, you got to come up with new procedures. Those are going to start creating, some financial impacts to them. I mean, their budgets aren't as big. They don't have the people in place, and they're going to have to start going out and trying to, find consultants or hire staff to help, run these new rules. And then the ones that really are going to get crushed initially, I think, are the accidental operators. The guys at the multinationals, even at the field level, probably they're going to be okay. But these smaller guys, the folks that didn't know they were ever regulated, they got to invent entire departments, entire organizations around not just the gathering rules, but even the new. If you never knew you were regulated in the first place, you got to come up with all sorts of processes, all sorts of procedures. You got to start being able to calculate MAOP. You got to be able to, you got to figure out your records. You're subject to audits that you've never been there before. So I think the greatest impact of all these rules is going to be, to the accidental guys, because they were never really aware that they were ever regulated in the first place. The annual reporting requirements for unregulated lines, I mean, they're onerous. If you're not ready for them, if you've never had to fill out a piece of paper before, it is going to be overwhelming in the very beginning. And there's a lot of people now being brought up underneath that rule. And the thing that really kind of brings it all home is 6 months after these regulations are promulgated, you're going to have to be ready to go. I mean, and if you're not, it's time for you to go find you that consultant can help you. Go start hiring the staff to help you. Because if you wait until the rule comes out, you're already behind 100 other people. And if you're behind 100 other people, you know, there's only so many consultants can do that work, and they're going to be busy. And so you may end up being in a situation where you're not going to be able to comply early enough. So,
Mark, I have a question for you. For these smaller operators, you know, that really haven't been doing this, you know, probably what's going to happen is this is going to fall in the lap of one person, say, okay, you're in charge of this now. And they're probably sweating a little bit right now. Yeah. What advice would you give them? Because they're going to have to go to their upper management and ask for support. They're going to have to ask for a budget. They might have to ask for more manpower. What advice would you give them to try to garner that support from upper management?
well, the first thing is you put the rule in front of them and say, guys, there's no deviation from this. We've got to do that. But start putting together. I mean, start identifying where your records are. Start identifying what you have. You know, pull files. You know, start organizing your files. You know, a lot of what we've seen, you know, and sometimes we go is, you know, yeah, there's the filing cabinet. It's got every piece of paper you ever wanted, but it's just shoved in there sequentially when it was generated. So you got valve inspection reports mixed in with MTRs, mixed in with hydro test reports, mixed in with safety safety meeting notes.
And that's just on the records side of things.
Right,
on the other side of it, what you need to get in place before you can even do any of that is, what is it that I'm going to do and how am I going to do it? So you're building your O&M manuals, you're building your supporting procedures, getting those processes in place. All of that stuff has to be reviewed on a regular basis for effectiveness, and that has to all be a formal, documented process. So all that documentation has to be there.
And if you're new to establishing damage prevention programs and public awareness programs, there's a lot that goes into
Absolutely.
And again, you know, we mentioned that there's several consultants that can do that work. Go find one. Go find a good one that you trust, and get them on a payroll already. They're the people who are going to be able to help you get through this quickly, efficiently, and correctly.
Okay, thank you to the panel. So we have received questions. So I think we have a bit of time to discuss. One that came in, with regards to preventive and mitigative measures, have there been suggestions in terms of technologies that should be used for overpressure protection? Maybe Hamoud, we'll start with you and others can jump in.
So a lot of these rules are still in the making. For overpressure protection, they are suggesting, for example, auto shut-off valves and remote control valves, and the leak detection systems as well. So those are some of the operators are currently using those already, but they were thinking of making them mandatory and including them in the IMP programs.
And that leads to, when you start thinking about whether to put in ASVs or RSVs or leak detection systems, when you go from an automatic to a remote, you have to decide, where is that remote coming from? It's probably going from a control room. If you have a leak detection system, where are those alarms going to? Probably a control room. Now you are jurisdictional under control room management regulations. So
exactly. I mean, we currently do these for different operators. We do PNM measure recommendations, and we've got IMP projects with different operators, and a lot of them are already using some of these, but they are suggested but not required at this point. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are additional requirements. So,
Okay, thank you very much. We've covered this topic a bit. I'll still ask the question, see if there are any additional comments you guys have. What additional documentation will be required when the new rules go into effect? Michael, maybe you have some additional thoughts on that?
well, we've talked about this quite a bit already, but I think it's very important, so it's probably worth hitting one more time. If you're just entering the regulatory world, what you need to learn is that you need to define formally in writing, in well-protected form, what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So every operator, whether you are already in the regulatory world or not, is going to have to revisit their O&M manual, okay? And all of the supporting documents, all of the supporting procedures, program documents, record retention, all of that. Each of these documents has to be reviewed on an annual basis to determine its effectiveness, to make edits to them, to keep them continuous improvement. All of that has to be documented and available for review. The records part of it, for every requirement, whether it be existing requirements or new requirements, there is a record that demonstrates that you did what you said you do the way you said you do it to meet that requirement. And as I said before, all of these records need to be very well managed, completely secured and protected, and easily accessible for anyone who needs to use them, whether that be from a regulatory compliance demonstration purpose or the people who are operating the pipeline. They need that information as well.
And just, even in an unregulated line, and you didn't hear the word, oh, you got to calculate, the MAOP, you got to calculate that with records. In order to determine whether or not you are regulated, unregulated, you got to know the MAOP. To know the MAOP means you got to know records. And so everything you do is it still comes back to the fact that you got to know what you got in the ground, and you got to know how you're going to operate it. And I know we're getting ready to close out. The one thing that when we were first talking about even the mega rule here, forget everything, forget these rules, forget everything. The one question you got to ask yourself is, how can I ensure that I'm operating this pipeline safely?
Absolutely.
And if you can't answer that question, that's the reason these rules exist.
Yeah.
We did not do a good job early enough in the game. I mean, I've got my demo here. Since 1990 to today, the rules have more than doubled in the number of pieces of paper. We're talking about doubling them again.
Yeah.
Because we as an industry sometimes didn't do what we were supposed to do.
And incidents keep occurring.
And until we get to that's good. Until we get to zero incidents, folks, we're going to be here annually still trying to answer why.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I want to thank the attendees for joining us this morning. I want to thank the panelists for their time, for their insights. It's very much appreciated. I'll pass it over to Larissa to wrap us up.
Thank you, Elena. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I apologize for the audio issues that we had earlier. It seems like maybe we had too many computers running in this room and it created some feedback, but no fear, because I'll be sending out a copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recording, and I'll try and fix the recording to where you hear it the way you're supposed to hear it. But also, there were several questions that we got in that we didn't have time to answer. I wanted to keep you within the hour and not go over. So what we're going to do is I'll compile them in a single document and I'll send it to our panel here to answer, and then I'll go ahead and send out the questions and answers of all of those questions to you guys. So if you happen to think of any questions later on, go ahead and reach out to us directly at info@g2-is.com. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.